The stage is yours.
Great, thank you. Well, it's almost midnight here. I'm usually wearing my pajamas by this time. So today I want to start off talking about why the best technology isn't always the winner. What's the state of identity today? Identity dogmatism and identity pragmatism. And hopefully I'll have some time for questions at the end. A little bit about myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Canadian, and for the Americans in the audience, this is where Canada is. I founded a company, Active State, and Skip Identity. I served a tour of duty at Microsoft, AWS, and Alexa. My undergrad was in mechanical engineering, which makes me very pragmatic, and I look a lot more on the engineering ways. How do we make something work? I'm much more of a builder than a science person, particularly around computers. A number of times in my career, I've had to deal with dogma as I try to do something pragmatic. One of the first times was in 1995, before I founded Active State and had Active Perl. I got Microsoft to pay me to port Perl 5 over to Windows NT. And this was a very pragmatic thing for me. I'd been building and running things on Windows since Windows 1, and I wanted to build websites, and everybody was using Perl 5, and I wanted Perl 5. But the Perl community was a little upset about this. You know, the dogma at this time was that Microsoft was not somebody you could partner with around open source. In fact, they were the devil. The next time was 2007 at Skip Identity. I helped found the OpenID Foundation. It was really OpenID versus SAML. And at this time, the dogma was that you needed to use XML DSIG for any kind of messages. Next was in 2012 when I was at Microsoft. I worked on what became OAuth 2. And then the dogma was that you had to have signed requests. You couldn't have bearer tokens, and they didn't want to enforce anyone having to go and use HTTPS. So some terminology that I'm going to use here. Everyone here is familiar with relying parties, RPs. I like to use the term developer because when I like to think of it as, when I'm thinking of it as markets rather than as protocols, that developer is a market. RPs isn't really a market. And they're the ones that are building the mobile or web app. Identity providers, IDP, the provider, and we all agree what a user is. And so there's developers, AKA RPs, providers, AKA IDPs, users, and they're all part of a three-sided market. All three of these entities need to be involved for us to be able to move around any personal identity. I'm sure most of you know what self-sovereign identity is, SSI, where the user has control, decentralized identifiers, DIDs. And what's the problem that I'm talking about today? Well, it's personal digital identity. It isn't enterprise identity. So what is digital identity? Well, I gave a talk on this when I was at Skip back in 2005. You can find it on YouTube. And I gave a derivative of that talk at the first EIC back in 2007. And there I talked about digital identity being all the digital information about you. But today I'm going to talk about reusable digital identity. Heavy emphasis on the reusable, something that you have that you can use over and over again to prove who you are, similar to in the physical world what we think of as use as passports and we use driver's license for. So let's talk about why the best technology isn't always the winner. What makes emerging technologies click? Well, I found some great article and a video from Wharton around why the best technologies isn't always a winner. But to boil it down, it's really around ecosystems. What's the ecosystem of the incumbent technology, and what ecosystem does the emerging technology require? And one of the examples that people can relate to is the combustion engine, the ecosystem of fossil fuels. And when the first EV came out, it failed. And part of why you could see it failed is you needed to cart around this charger to charge up your car because there was no EV ecosystem. And so the industry took a intermediate step of hybrids because a hybrid car could work with the ICE ecosystem. Toyota had the Prius, and they were able to go and advance their EV technology. So let's look at some past identity attempts. Microsoft had Passport. The internet thoroughly rejected that because Microsoft was at the center. They came out with something that was more decentralized and user control with card space. And of all the issues as to why it failed, one of the big ones was the cold start. All these players did not have the technology. Mozilla took a run at this with Persona. One of the key reasons that didn't take off as well was the cold start of trying to get the ecosystem going. With OpenID, specifically OpenID 2.0, it had this kind of experience where you would enter in your URL, click login, and that URL could be your blog, it could be any URL you controlled, and you could be your own OpenID provider. But a key aspect of it was that you could use existing accounts because Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo all added support for OpenID, and you could use all of them to log into a site that supported OpenID. And so this had a warm start for both users and providers. It wasn't a full cold start. And from the developer's perspective, it was reasonably successful. There were 42,000 out of the top million at its peak of OpenID. But it failed because it just couldn't cross the chasm. All the technorati, the innovators and early adopters knew what to do when they came across this, to enter in their URL, their blog, or something like that. But most people didn't understand what they had to do. But despite that, OpenID was actually quite successful in comparison. When you look at how Google has done, peak Google was a few years ago and was only 27 of the 1,000 of the top million sites. So let's look at identity today. We've got FIDO and WebAuthn, reusable, phishing resistant second factors. OpenID Connect has become the dominant federation protocol for consumer technology. You've got government EIDs that have been deployed and are widely used in their jurisdictions. And CIAM, Customer Identity and Access Management, has become very popular for developers to use with a wide array of vendors. And this segment of the market really came into its own when people saw that Okta paid $6.5 billion for Auth0. Identity verification is a booming market that has been accelerated by the pandemic. You know, a big indication of that is the financing. Verif raised 69 million, ID.me 100 million, Jumio 150 million, Trulio 394 million. But all of these things are successful because they're building on the existing ecosystem. They're taking existing government ID, selfies, photos, the technology that's around to turn that into digital ID for their customers. What are the common identifiers today? Email and phone. Most frequent identity verification on the internet today? Email and phone. And of course, we have social login. You know, Google, Facebook, and now coming up Apple are what you commonly see. And they all have hundreds of security engineers looking at hundreds of signals and providing unrivaled account protection. And it's reusable identity. So authentication's obviously reusable. They all have name, a couple of them have a profile photo, and a couple of them have verified email. But if you look at the stats, while Facebook and Google have 10% penetration in top 10,000 sites, when you drop down to the top 1 million sites, it's only in the mid single digits of penetration. And you know, Google and Facebook are in decline. They peaked a few years ago. And social login is a threat. They own the identity, and they can take it away from the user and take it away from the developer. And now that they're moving identity into their wallets, which previously were used for payments, I think we should all be somewhat concerned as to who they let into the wallet and who they don't let in. Which leads us to why DIDs are so great. They're decentralized. There's no central authority. They have user control, and they can be used to identify anything. But there is DID dogma, and it reminds me often of crypto dogma. There was a recent article in the Financial Times, Inside the Cult of Crypto, predicting the collapse of the bank and attacking anybody who doesn't believe with them, and distrust of anybody that isn't in their own circle, worshiping their leaders, and of course, sacrificing to change the world. So what's the DID dogma? Self-sovereign identity must use DIDs. Their definition of SSI is that it's very DID-centric. DIDs must use crypto, and thou must control thine key, and only DIDs can empower users and change the world. Now, in the EU, I can see why DIDs are popular. It's a great way to counteract American big tech, but there's a lot of DID adoption issues. At this point, I start to feel like Shrek standing in front of the villagers, but the haters are going to hate. The biggest issue for DIDs is really that cold start once again. They're not building upon any existing infrastructure and identity that's out there. And the other big issue is, there's a DID standard, but nobody could agree on what it was. There's 109 provisional DID methods the last time I checked. And what about the identity verification vendors? These guys have got a lot of money. They've raised money. They're out there dealing with customers, developers today, providing effectively digital identity to those customers. What's their place in the DID ecosystem? When I was at Amazon, I really aligned on the customer obsession, working backwards from the customer. So who's the DID customer? Well, when I look at it, it seems to me that the customer are users. And as users, they just are saying, like, I want a pony. Here's the things that I want. I think of the market that developers are really the customer, because developers decide what to offer their users. And developers aren't interested in changing the world of identity. They're interested in the jobs they're trying to do. They have things they're trying to accomplish, and they just want a tool that's going to get it done. And that brings us to pragmatism. I was very excited, is it yesterday? Yeah, it's yesterday now, about the announcement of Gain, because they're building on the current ecosystem. An example of that was Netflix. When Netflix, they'd had a new business model of subscribed content, but they didn't start off in the streaming business. They started off with DVDs and USPS, the existing ecosystem. Gain is out there to provide assured identity for both users and RPs, and it's strong, it's heavy duty. But one of my concerns was, is it too strong for, I think it actually is probably way too strong for most use cases. And they seem to be focused that providers are their customers, which isn't surprising, because they're working with banks and other regulated organizations. And I see that that actually could become somewhat of a problem. Just how crypto is versus the banks and trying to take down the banks. I'm a little concerned about DIDs and whether the DID community is going to be attacking Gain. So let me tell you a bit about Hellō. We like to think of it as Visa for digital identity. We're building on the current ecosystem, just like Netflix and Gain are doing. But we like to think of developers as our customers, because once again, developers decide what to offer their users. And we start with existing technology. Developers already familiar with OpenID Connect. There's libraries in every language. All the SIAM vendors support it. Users have an account at one or more login providers that already have an existing federation API. And users are familiar with this redirect flow. They click on a button and go somewhere else and then come back. 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. That was a big lift for us for people to understand what happened when they clicked on the button. And we connect this with an identity interchange, the Hellō interchange. And this provides privacy for the user, because from the provider's point of view, the user's always logging into Hellō. Hellō looks like an app to them. It is an app to them. And from the developer's point of view, Hellō always looks like a provider. The developer doesn't know who the user has chosen as their login provider. And the user has a broad choice in provider. They can choose any provider Hellō supports. And if they don't like their provider, they can change providers. And if they enroll backup providers, they can go and recover their account in case their preferred provider takes their account away from them. So the user has a lot of control in Hellō. And for the people that insist on using email and phone, we'll support magic links. And if they're on a device that supports WebAuthn, like an iPhone, then they can enroll Touch ID and Face ID. And we connect that with a human-friendly brand, Hellō. Rather than sign in or log in, the button would say Hellō. And we chose Hellō because that word was popularized in our first digital interactions. What did you say when you answered the phone? So just like Gain, we have a warm start with users and providers, but people would be concerned there's a central service. Well, to deal with that, the interchange itself is a distributed identity interchange built from independent components that we believe gives users self-sovereign identity. Hellō contracts out to independent trustees that are in independent geopolitical jurisdictions, which makes them opaque to an intelligent agency in that jurisdiction, but allows law enforcement access to the user data, but it's a really high bar because they need subpoenas across multiple geopolitical jurisdictions. Hellō has no administrative control over users or developers, and there's full transparency on the source code, architecture, DevOps, and trustees. Of course, the interchange is distributed globally. Business model is developers pay a small interchange fee for each verified claim. like a verified email, verified phone, not unlike what they pay Twilio if they want to verify an email or a phone today. In the future, we'll support integration with the verified identity vendors and hopefully the government EIDs. And we also hope to be able to integrate with GAIN. Excuse me. You may have noticed that Hellō, the domain, is .coop. Hellō is not a corporation, it's a cooperative. We're not out to extract rents or increase shareholder value. We're all about increasing member value. We have both user and corporate members. And so what's the status of Hellō? We have 3 corporate members that are well known that have joined, actively recruiting other corporate members, well-tested UX. We're testing our DevX MVP now with a goal of having running code in minutes and deployed code in hours. So if personal identity is core to your business, please come and say hello and let's change the world together. And I think I have a little bit of time left for questions.